Good evening. Welcome to Maryville College and the second presentation of the 2025-2026 Witherspoon Lecture Series. We're so pleased to have you join us in this semi-quincentennial year of our nation's founding and are eager to learn more about the revolution in the Southern Appalachians. My name is Daniel Klingensmith, and I am a history professor here at Maryville College and the Ralph S. Collins Professor in the Humanities. While my area of expertise is more modern world history, 20th century Europe and Asia in particular, I find myself intrigued by the American Revolution in this milestone year, and especially by the lens through which we at Maryville College have chosen to celebrate it, by exploring how the early settlers and Native Americans in this region experienced it. If you've been around Maryville College in the last 5 years, you've likely heard our president, Dr. Brian Coker, say that we are striving to be more of and for the region. Using opportunities like this lecture series to align on that mission are important, and as a historian, I would say a lot of fun too. Before I introduce our speaker, we have some people that I'd like to recognize. First, we're thrilled that the alumni who made the Witherspoon Lecture Series possible were able to join us again tonight. Newell and Mary Lee Witherspoon, members of the classes of 1952 and 1956, respectively, endowed this program in 2022. They are here with their daughters. I would like to ask them all to stand, and let's please show our appreciation for their contributions to Maryville College. Thank you for making this possible. In endowing this series, Newell and Mary's intention was to bring to the campus presentations by outstanding academic and professional individuals and to support opportunities that bring campus and wider community members together to learn about and discuss topics that are important, timely, and of broad interest. This year's theme and speakers certainly check a lot of those boxes. We would also like to thank the Mary Blunt chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, who are set up out in the lobby. Please stop by their tables after tonight's lecture to enjoy some refreshments and to learn more about their organization. And finally, we'd like to thank the East Tennessee Historical Society, which is recording all of this year's Witherspoon lectures to share with audiences later this spring. We appreciate you being here. If you haven't already, please mark your calendars for the last lecture of the series, which is scheduled for March 23rd, same time, same place. On that night, Dr. Chris Magra of the University of Tennessee will cover Wautogan self-governance and the Declaration of Independence. We hope to see you then. Now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Michael Lynch earned his bachelor's degree in history at Lincoln Memorial University in Harrogate, Tennessee, and his master's and doctoral degree in history from the University of Tennessee, where he received the prestigious Milton Kline Fellowship. He defended his dissertation, Backwater Men, Gender and the Fate of a Revolutionary Coalition on a Southern Frontier, in 2020 as the doctoral student of Dr. Magra, whom I just announced will be our third and final lecturer in this series. Dr. Lynch has been awarded research fellowships from the David Library of the American Revolution, the North Caroliniana Society, and the Center for the Study of War and Society. He is the author of numerous articles and essays on the Revolutionary War, memorialization of the American Revolution, and the late 18th century frontier. Since 2017, Dr. Lynch has directed LMU's Abraham Lincoln Museum and Library, which is home to one of the world's largest collections of Lincoln and Civil War material. He and his team recently completed an award-winning multi-million-dollar renovation of their exhibit galleries. Following his presentation, Dr. Lynch will be joined by my faculty colleague who was here with us last week, a professor of history, Dr. Aaron Astor, who will be leading the question and answer session. Dr. Astor earned his bachelor's degree at Hamilton College in New York in 1995 and his PhD in history at Northwestern University in 2006. A year later, he joined our faculty in the Humanities Division and has spent nearly 20 years teaching American, Appalachian, and Southern history. Dr. Astor is also coordinator of our Appalachian Studies minor. Again, welcome and thank you for attending I'd now like to invite Dr. Michael Lynch to the podium.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for having me here. As you heard when I was introduced, my day job is director of the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum in Harrogate, Tennessee. But the focus of my research and writing is the southern frontier and backcountry during the Revolution. So it's really nice to be talking about something besides Abraham Lincoln and to have a good excuse to come here and talk about a subject that's a little more near and dear to my heart. And I want to thank the Witherspoon family for making this possible, and to Maryville College for the invitation. I will nevertheless give a plug to the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum while I'm here. My mother was a university development officer, and she always taught me never to miss a good excuse to get some publicity for the institution. So the museum is home to one of the largest private Lincoln and Civil War collections anywhere in the country. We have a lot of personal effects of the Lincoln family. We have a really fantastic collection of manuscripts, journals, one of the world's best collections of Civil War era sheet music, prints, as well as the best collection of Confederate-made pistols and medical instruments that you will see anywhere. So if you have a chance to visit us in Harrogate near the Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, right where Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia converge, we'd be happy to have you. So I'm going to talk about the original Tennessee volunteers, not the ones that we're more familiar with from the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, which is really where the nickname comes from, but from an earlier set of volunteers who participated in the American Revolution, and specifically we'll talk about their involvement in the Southern campaign. The idea of hardy frontiersmen and riflemen who flocked to the standard of America in its time of need has precedence going all the way back to the American Revolution, and specifically to the Overmountain men. Those of you who've been to Sycamore Shoals State Historic Site, or a state park near Elizabethton, Tennessee, will be familiar with the sculpture. This is an image of one of the Overmountain men that stands at that site, a place that Dr. Astor, I understand, talked about during his lecture, and that we'll be talking about a little bit more today. And specifically, I want to focus on three factors that I think loomed especially large in the experiences of the Overmountain men in the Revolution and their involvement in the Revolution, and really that determine the nature of their involvement in the Revolution. And there are three factors that also loom large in modern day scholarship on the 18th century frontier. Three things that really set the frontier apart from a lot of other regions in colonial America and in British North America in the 18th century. And we'll look at how these three different factors by turns drew these men into the Revolution and also kept them out of the Revolution. I really think that if you want to understand the relationship of the Overmountain men with the Revolution, you have to understand the centripetal forces and the centrifugal forces. The forces that pulled them into the conflict in the East, that pulled them out of their mountain settlements here in what became eastern Tennessee, at that time still part of western North Carolina and southwestern Virginia, as well as those factors that kept them from mobilizing as frequently as revolutionary authorities, both civil authorities and military authorities would have preferred. And those three factors are, first of all, the fact that in the 18th century, the word frontier had a particular meaning, and that was the idea that a frontier was a very, very dangerous military border zone. Today we think of a frontier as something that advances. And if you look at the frontier in the scholarship of American history, In earlier periods, in many cases, what we're talking about is the advancement of settlement. That's not exactly the sense that the term frontier was used during the 18th century. If you said that you lived on a frontier during the Revolutionary period, basically what you were saying is that you lived in a region that was likely to contract because it was right on the edge of enemy territory. And the enemies that these frontiersmen were specifically referring to when they said they lived on a frontier were their Native American neighbors. And second, we'll look at the impact of the homestead ethic on frontier participation in the Revolution. The homestead ethic has been defined by one historian of this period as the belief in the right to occupy a family-sized farm, enough land to keep your family fed and secure, and specifically the right peacefully to occupy the homestead without fear of violence to person and property. This commitment to families and farms, which are really the twin concepts that made the homestead ethic what it is, I think was kind of the lodestar of what frontiersmen were after in the American Revolution. And finally, the idea of the frontier as a zone where authority is very tenuous, where authority is not very secure, whether that authority is internal or external. Leaders on the frontier could never take their authority for granted. It had to be earned, and it was always very tentative, and it happened by consent from the people they led. And external authority was something that frontiersmen were famously very, very resistant to if that authority wasn't meeting their needs. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, this is a quote by William Tatham. He was an Englishman who lived in the early settlements along the Watauga River, sort of the core of what would become the first settlements in East Tennessee in the 1770s. And in speaking about the attitude of these frontiersmen toward authority, he said, "I also am a backwoodsman," because he lived among them. "I can also vouch for their promptitude to resent intended insult, to treat the appearance of arrogance with contemptuous roughness, and to be mulish in a refusal of what they think extorted from them by coercion or required by means of unfair traffic." Basically, he was saying that frontiersmen in the present-day Appalachian Mountains were really, really ornery, right? And this is a factor that we're going to see affecting their relationship to the Revolution. Now, this need for security and this disdain for authority is something that's really decisive in causing a lot of the Overmountain men, that is, men who lived in what's now northeastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia, to rally to the Revolution to begin with. The last lecture, if you were here, Dr. Astor talked about some of the background to their initial allegiances in the Revolution, and he may have mentioned that in the summer of 1776, settlers in what's now eastern Tennessee along the Watauga and the Nolichucky rivers actually petitioned for inclusion in the rest of North Carolina by writing what we might call a declaration of dependence. They knew that they were living on a vulnerable frontier. They knew that they needed security from the Indians, especially the Cherokees, who were determined to take back their hunting grounds that the settlers had occupied. And they needed legitimacy for their land claims. It's really popular to think of frontiersmen as people who aren't really subject to much of anything. If you've seen the movie The Last of the Mohicans, there's this great scene where Daniel Day-Lewis's character, he's the very image of a frontiersman. He's wearing deer skins and he's got his rifle and his tomahawk, and it's during the French and Indian War, and a British officer says, do you consider yourself a loyal subject to the crown? And he says, I don't really consider myself subject to much of anything at all. And there's a streak of that we see in the early American frontier, but that attitude will only take you so far. Most of these frontiersmen don't necessarily want less government. They want better government and more responsive government that is going to meet their needs. And their biggest need, as they're living on the edges of Indian country, is for security, protection, and legitimacy. You can't maintain a homestead unless you're safe, and unless you have, some type of at least a pretense of a title to that land. So in 1776, the Watauguans send this petition to the North Carolina government asking to be incorporated into the larger revolutionary movement and into the new nation that the Americans are building and the new state that the North Carolinians are building, and they succeed. The Watauguans are incorporated into North Carolina, and the Watauga settlements are turned into two new counties: Sullivan County in the northeastern corner of the state, and Washington County, which is centered on sort of what's now the city of Jonesboro. Now, the other factor that's really significant in the relationship between these frontiersmen and the rest of the Revolution is the fact that frontiersmen in the 18th century have a reputation as ideal wilderness warriors. There's this idea that frontiersmen are hardened Indian fighters. They're suited to backwoods combat, what we would call bushfighting, and they're expert riflemen. And this idea is in heavy circulation during the early years of the Revolutionary War. John Hancock touted Western frontiersmen as the finest marksmen in the world, who do executions with their rifle guns at an amazing distance. John Adams called them the most accurate marksmen in the world. They kill with great exactness at 200 yards distance. They have sworn certain death to the ministerial officers, meaning officers in the British Army fighting for the king's ministers. May they perform their oath. And Washington actually was so committed to this idea of frontiersmen as marksmen and playing up this idea of Western frontiersmen as deadly combatants that he recommended that all of his soldiers be outfitted with fringed hunting shirts. These long fringed, caped hunting shirts that men wore on the frontier because, as he said, it is a dress justly supposed to carry no small terror to the enemy, who think every such person a complete marksman. And you can see one of those hunting shirts in this image here. This is a drawing that was made by a French soldier at Yorktown. And over there on the left, there's a black soldier from one of the all-black Rhode Island units that was created late in the war. And then we have a soldier from one of the mid-Atlantic regiments. And then the third, you can see the wide-brimmed hat and the rifle and the tomahawk. And he's wearing one of these long shirts with the fringes that was sort of characteristic on the frontier. There's a young veteran of the Battle of Kings Mountain, which we'll be talking about, who said the hunting shirt in the backcountry was universally worn. And frontiersmen are aware of their reputation as fine marksmen, as skilled at bushfighting, and as good soldiers. And they play this up when they're petitioning for annexation in the East. In 1774, in the wake of Lord Dunmore's War, which was the last sort of conflict between British colonists and Indians in the western frontier, there were a group of Western militiamen who convened at Fort Gower and issued resolves concerning the ongoing dispute with Great Britain, boasting that they could, and this is a quote, live weeks without bread or salt, sleep in the open air without any covering but that of the canopy of heaven, and march and shoot with any in the known world. And in that petition that I was talking about a few minutes ago that the Watauguans sent to North Carolina in the summer of 1776 to convince them to let them be incorporated in the revolutionary movement, they said they had raised a company of fine riflemen. So there's this idea that's very prevalent on both sides of the Atlantic that frontiersmen make good soldiers. Now, this is going to be very, very important in the Southern campaigns that break out in the later years of the war. The South was incredibly significant to the Revolutionary War, and this is something that you unfortunately miss in a lot of popular presentations of the war. We were talking about this some of the faculty and the history students and myself at dinner that if you watch a lot of documentaries about the Revolution or read popular books about the Revolution, you'll get the idea that the war breaks out in New England. It has its turning point in Saratoga in upstate New York. And then Cornwallis somehow ends up in Virginia. We're not really sure how, and he's captured by the French and the Americans, and nothing really happens in between. And this is completely mistaken. About 1/5 of all the war's combat deaths happen in the state of South Carolina just in the last 2 years of the conflict, okay? And this is a theater in which the Overmountain men are really gonna make their decisive contribution to American victory. So the reason the British come south is because the war in the North has stalemated. They've learned that New England can't really be isolated from the rest of the colonies. They've tried that at Saratoga, it doesn't work. They've learned that there aren't as many loyalists in the middle colonies as they had been led to believe. But there are many, many loyal Southerners who have gone into exile across the Atlantic, and they're trying to persuade British planners that if they send an expeditionary force to the South, that these Tories who are living under the heel of Patriot occupation will rise up and they will form an auxiliary force that will hold the territory that British soldiers conquer. So from late 1778, this is going to be the main theater of the war, between late 1778 and the fall of 1781. Most of the major combat operations are going to happen in the South. And this is only a few of the major engagements that are happening in the South over the course of the war. This is a map from the American Battlefield Trust. It'll give you a sense of how many major engagements are happening there, as well as countless minor engagements, small skirmishes, murders, confrontations between small parties of militia and Tories and British soldiers. It's possible that there are actually more combat actions fought in South Carolina than in any other state, with the possible exception of New Jersey. So after the fall of Charleston, South Carolina in May 1780, which is the worst American defeat of the entire war, there are more than 5,000 British soldiers or 5,000 American soldiers that fall into British hands at a stroke when Charleston capitulates to the British. The British establish a chain of posts, fortifications, linking the backcountry going up into the foothills with the coast. And they also begin organizing the Loyalist militia. They're putting this theory that there's lots of Loyalist manpower in the South into practice. And by the end of 1780, there are somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Tory militia that are organized in the South Carolina backcountry. And the man who's responsible for organizing them, the inspector of militia, is a Scotsman named Major Patrick Ferguson. He's most well known for patenting a new form of a rifle that's a breech loader, so it can be loaded and fired much more rapidly than the standard muzzle loaders that are in common use during the American Revolution by twisting the trigger guard, and that allows you to load a ball under the hammer. And so it's a much more efficient rifle than was standard during the Revolution. Between May and August of 1780, there are countless skirmishes in the South Carolina backcountry between Ferguson's Tories, the provincials that Ferguson commanded, which were Americans that had been enlisted into the regular British forces, and backcountry militia from North Carolina, South Carolina, and the interior part of Georgia. Now, here's where that homestead ethic I was talking about comes into play. As Ferguson's men are occupying forts pushing up toward the Appalachian Mountains, they pose a direct threat to the homesteads of these men living in what's now eastern Tennessee, at that time western North Carolina. And some of these men are going to cross the mountains. They're going to come into South Carolina under the command of this gentleman right here, Isaac Shelby. He's the lieutenant colonel of the Sullivan County Militia. His father, Evan Shelby, was one of the most important and first settlers around what's now Bristol, Tennessee. At that time, it was still called Shelby's Fort. And some of these men are going to march into South Carolina, where they're going to join with South Carolinians commanded by James Williams, North Carolinians commanded by Charles McDowell, and a Georgian named Elijah Clark. And they're going to fight a series of battles with the militia and the Tories that Ferguson has organized. A couple of these engagements in July and August of 1780 take place at Thickety Fort, which Shelby and the other backwoodsmen capture without firing a shot. They're going to bloody one of Ferguson's detachments at a place called Wofford's Iron Works or Cedar Springs in August. And then that same month, they're going to maul another loyalist force at this place, Musgrove Mill on the Enoree River in upstate South Carolina. It's a state park now. It's an absolutely pristine battlefield. If you haven't been there, you should definitely go. They've done a lot of fantastic interpretive work here. And what the Patriots basically did was align themselves in open order behind a sort of quickly thrown together fortification along the top of that ridge, and then they bait the Tories into attacking uphill and effect a kind of an encirclement. So the Overmountain men are active in the war well before the Battle of Kings Mountain, which we consider to be their main contribution to the American war effort. I consider this sort of the first stage of their involvement in the Revolution, their activity in these small skirmishes where they're cooperating with other militiamen from the backcountry of other southern states. Now, this battle at Musgrove's Mill happens, it's interesting, there's a little bit of debate about when the battle happens, but it's probably August 18th. Some sources indicate August 19th of 1780. Right after the victory is won, they find out that a couple of days before, on August the 16th, there's been a disastrous American defeat at Camden. Regular American force, Continentals and militia, under the command of Horatio Gates, have been annihilated at this battle in the center of what's now South Carolina. And so there's basically nothing to stop the British from advancing into North Carolina or pushing further into the backcountry and annihilating them entirely. So the Overmountain men are going to retreat west of the mountains again, along with some of the refugees of backcountry units who live east of the mountains, and they're going to use the mountains as a kind of a sanctuary while the British are gathering their forces to continue pushing north into North Carolina. That's going to happen in the fall. In the fall of 1780, once the harvest is in and Cornwallis has resupplied his army, the British commander Charles Cornwallis, he's going to move north toward Charlotte, and he's going to send Patrick Ferguson off to the west toward the Appalachian Mountains to cover his left flank. Now, this begins the second phase of the Overmountain men's involvement in the Southern campaign, the one that you're probably the most familiar with and the decisive one when they make their most important contribution to the American victory. And it happens because Ferguson makes a really, really serious mistake. He breaks one of the cardinal rules of warfare, which is never pick a fight with an angry mountain man who's content to otherwise mind his own business, right? Ferguson has captured a cousin of Isaac Shelby's. He sends this cousin west of the mountains with a message, and this is from a memoir that Shelby wrote relating Ferguson's message. He charges this messenger to inform the officers on the western waters that if they did not desist from their opposition to the British arms and take protection under his standard, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. It's meant to intimidate the Overmountain men. What it does is it makes them really, really angry, right? It's sort of like kicking a hornet's nest. So whereas before there were small numbers of Overmountain men under Shelby from Sullivan County fighting in upstate South Carolina, Now he's going to bring down basically the entire militia contingents of Washington and Sullivan counties, North Carolina, along with other militiamen from Washington County, Virginia, what's now sort of the southwestern tip of Virginia. When Shelby gets this message, he goes about 40 miles to meet with this gentleman right here, John Sevier, who will become the first governor of Tennessee. At this time, he's the lieutenant colonel of militia in Washington County, North Carolina. And they form a plan to rally all of the militia west of the mountains, march east, link up with other backwoodsmen there, and annihilate Ferguson's force. So there's going to be a triumvirate of officers that's going to be involved in organizing this campaign. It's going to be Shelby, Sevier, and Colonel William Campbell. Unfortunately, he was inconsiderate enough to die before anybody could paint his portrait, but this is his grave at Aspenvale Cemetery, which is sort of between Abingdon and Marion, Virginia. And there are going to be about 240 men from Washington County under Sevier, 240 more under Shelby from Sullivan County, and about 400 men from Virginia under William Campbell. And they're going to gather at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River to rally for this march over the mountains. This is one of the great moments in Tennessee military history, and it was painted by one of the great historic Tennessee artists, a guy named Lloyd Branson. He was actually a Knoxville artist who worked in the late 1800s, early 1900s, painted this image of the muster at Sycamore Shoals. You can see Fort Watauga there in the background. This painting is now in the Tennessee State Museum. It was on exhibit at the East Tennessee Historical Society a few years ago. What I think accounts for this muster is the fact that Ferguson solved a dilemma that the Overmountain men had. Earlier in the war, the debate is over whether to stay and defend their farms, their homesteads from the Cherokees, who were their close neighbors and their enemies, or march east to take on the British. Well, now defending your homestead and marching east to take on the British, it's basically the same thing. Ferguson has threatened to march over the mountains and burn their farms, burn their homesteads, take their property, hang their leaders. So there's no question between an offense east of the mountains or a defense west of the mountains, right? Ferguson has basically solved the mobilization problem that the Overmountain men have always had. So they march east of the mountains, and the route is preserved in the modern-day Overmountain Victory Trail, which you can either walk or drive. I drove because I'm not as fit as they were, but it's a route that goes from modern-day Sycamore Shoals all the way down to Kings Mountain, this small ridge on the North Carolina-South Carolina line. And over there on the right, you can see the different camps that the Overmountain men camped at every night of the battle, or every night of the campaign. They actually planned to meet Ferguson at Gilberttown, there just south of present-day Asheville. When they arrived there on October the 4th, Ferguson isn't there because he's found out the Overmountain men are coming after him, and so he retreats to Kings Mountain, this small ridge on the North Carolina-South Carolina line. I don't know how many of you have been to Kings Mountain, but it's a little ridge about 60 feet high. It's kind of a shoe-shaped mountain. It's kind of narrow like a heel at one end, and then it sort of expands at the other end. It's wooded all up the sides. Really easily defensible terrain, unless you're fighting a bunch of frontiersmen who are used to bush fighting and who are expert marksmen. Now, this is a map of the battle from the American Battlefield Trust, and you can see here that the Overmountain men and the other militiamen basically surrounded the mountain and fought up the sides until they had the Tories pinned in right up there in the summit. The Overmountain men are down here at the sort of narrow point of the shoe, and then the other South Carolinians and North Carolinians are arrayed around the other end. So it's a three-dimensional battlefield. It's a battle that doesn't have any rear. They completely surround the mountain, and they fight their way up the slopes until they have the Tories surrounded. And this is a 19th century image of the battlefield, and you can see that they're standing behind those trees and fortifying themselves behind those rocks, which is interesting because this is kind of the image that a lot of us have of how the Revolutionary War was fought, right? There's this popular image that the British were not adapted to woods fighting, that they couldn't adapt to North American conditions, and that Americans win their victories by fighting undercover and fighting Indian style. Generally, that's not what happens. There are two problems with this myth, and one problem is the fact that the British actually really could adapt to woods fighting. They had been doing so since the French and Indian War. There are light infantry units that have been in place in the British Army since the decade before the Revolution that are very, very good at fighting in woods. And the second reason this is mistaken is because this isn't how most of the American victories are won. Most of the major battles are fought using regular troops, long-term professional soldiers who are fighting in rank and file the same way that the British are fighting, using linear tactics. But there are these exceptions, and Kings Mountain is probably the major one of these exceptions. It's a major victory that's fought and won by backwoodsmen who have fought Indians. They're veterans of Indian conflicts, and they're fighting using today what we would consider to be guerrilla tactics. And we can get a sense of how this worked by looking at the journal of Alexander Chesney. He was a South Carolina loyalist who was Ferguson's adjutant. He signed up to join Ferguson's force not too long before the Battle of Kings Mountain, which is like the worst possible time, to join the loyalist force. And Chesney said, Kings Mountain from its height would have enabled us to oppose a superior force with advantage had it not been covered with wood which sheltered the Americans and enabled them to fight in their favorite manner, that is, fighting from behind trees and barriers. In fact, after driving in our pickets, they were able to advance in 3 divisions under separate leaders to the crest of the hill in perfect safety until they took post and opened an irregular but destructive fire from behind trees and other cover. And so near the end of the battle, Ferguson tries to break out, and there are a number of rifles that are pointed right in his direction. He's blown off of his horse. He's dragged by one stirrup. The horses drag him through the American lines, and the other Tories on the summit of the mountain are surrounded. There's another eyewitness account, an American, a patriot who was at Kings Mountain, who said that Ferguson's clothes were literally shot to pieces. There were so many rifles that were pointed at him as the battle was ending, and the fatal shot is traditionally attributed to a militiaman from what's now Tennessee named Robert Young. So Kings Mountain is a significant turning point in the Revolution, not only because it derails this invasion of North Carolina, it forces Cornwallis to retreat from Charlotte and return to South Carolina and reorganize his forces there, but also because in defeating these Tory militiamen and showing that they could be defeated, it sort of undermines the whole principle of the Southern campaign, right? The reason that the British had come south in the first place was to organize these Tories, hoping that they could defend themselves and that the British soldiers could then move on and continue rolling up American territory as they move north. And what I think is interesting about Kings Mountain, and this is something that I think a lot of histories of the war don't really point out, is that after Kings Mountain, we don't really see any other major battles that are fought solely by Tory militia. And I think that's because Cornwallis, who's left in command of the British forces in the South, he never really put a whole lot of stock in Ferguson in the first place. And after this Tory detachment at Kings Mountain is wiped out, Cornwallis, I think, loses whatever little faith he had left in the Tory militia, the Tories that had been organized in the South, and now he's sort of right back where he started, right? All this work at organizing the Tories in the backcountry has been undone in a single afternoon in October of 1780, and Cornwallis is left with this very small force of British soldiers to try to secure South Carolina and then move into North Carolina again. And this is a job that is just too great for the number of regulars that he has. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the problems on the frontier that leaders face and also that Eastern authorities face in trying to organize the frontier is the tenuousness of authority. The problem of exerting authority over men who don't really want to be controlled. And this is one of the things that really mars the victory at Kings Mountain, because they capture all these prisoners. There are about 1,000 Tories at Kings Mountain, somewhere between 900 and 1,000 of the patriots. And the ones that aren't killed and buried in these very, very shallow graves are going to be marched back into the interior of North Carolina. But the problem is that now that the battle's over, the militiamen that these officers have marched over the mountains, they're really, really hard to control. And you can trace this by looking at the general orders that William Campbell issues on the return march. Remember, Campbell's the officer from Washington County, Virginia, that Shelby and Sevier enlist to come to this muster at Sycamore Shoals. He's kind of the nominal commander of the expedition. There isn't really a formal command structure. What happens is all the commanders will just sort of get together at the beginning of each day. They'll hash out what they're trying to do, and then they'll let Campbell execute those orders. And his general orders on the return march have been preserved, and you can get a sense of the difficulties these leaders were facing when you read these documents. And the funny thing is, as you trace these orders out chronologically, you can see how Campbell is gradually losing control. The orders get less and less assertive, and it's almost like he's kind of bargaining with these men to try to keep them disciplined. So this is 4 days after the battle, General Orders, 11th October, 1780. I must request the officers of all ranks in the army to endeavor to restrain the disorderly manner of slaughtering and disturbing the prisoners. If it cannot be prevented by moderate measures, such effectual punishment shall be executed upon delinquents as will put a stop to it, right? Now, one of the things that the Americans pride themselves on is what the historian David Hackett Fisher has called the policy of humanity. The idea that the British are these bad guys who treat their prisoners really badly and plunder civilians and burn houses and bombard towns. But as virtuous American revolutionaries, we don't do that sort of thing, right? So this is really not the kind of behavior that officers in the regular American army are going to want to encourage. And you can see, Campbell's really, he's wagging his finger at these guys. He's really trying to get them to shape up. And then another set of general orders from 3 days later. It is with anxiety I hear the complaints of the inhabitants on account of the plundering parties who issue out from the camp and indiscriminately rob both Whig or Patriot and Tory, leaving our friends, I believe, in a worse situation than the enemy would have done. I hope the officers will exert themselves in suppressing this abominable practice, degrading to the name of soldier by keeping their soldiers close in camp and preventing their straggling off upon our marches. And in case you were wondering how well this effort to restrain the men from killing the prisoners was going, this very night, the 14th of October, the Overmountain men are camped at a place in North Carolina called Bickerstaff's Old Fields, where some of the Carolinians come to the officers and they say, there are a lot of these guys among the prisoners who have been doing really, really bad things. They've murdered patriots, they've broken into houses, they've robbed, they've plundered, they've abused women. Let's have a trial and hang a bunch of them. Okay? And so, the officers agree that they're going to put these men on trial. They have a sort of an impromptu, board of, a trial board. And 36 of these Tory prisoners are condemned to hang. And so by torchlight, they start hanging them 3 at a time, from these tree branches. until finally the commanders step in and they say, okay, we've killed 9 of these guys. That's enough for now. Let's call a halt to it, fellas. And then by the time we get to the 26th of October, this is 19 days after the battle, now Campbell isn't ordering, he's hoping in the passive voice that these guys are gonna get their act together. It is hoped no insult or violence unmerited will be offered to them, the prisoners. My wish is that no unnecessary injury be done to the inhabitants of this place or to the adjacent country. And then significantly, he says, no liquor to be sold or issued to the troops without an order from the commanding officer for the time being. This order respects all retailers of spirituous liquors in or near camp of which they are to be made acquainted. So this second phase of the Overmountain men's involvement in the revolution reveals that as far as the Patriots are concerned, the Overmountain men are kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's no regular American resistance left in South Carolina and North Carolina except for these guys, right? One American army's been wiped out at Charleston. One of them has been broken at Camden. These guys are basically carrying the entire American war effort in the backcountry on their own. On the other hand, they're really, really undisciplined. You can't exchange Tory prisoners when those prisoners have been hanged or clubbed or shot or stabbed along the road. And it doesn't do much for public opinion when these mountaineers are going around plundering everybody in the countryside on their return march home, right? So there's sort of this paradox. On the one hand, this need to defend their homes, this homestead ethic convinces them to go after Ferguson, but then when they get there, there's a sense in which these guys are, if not more trouble than they're worth, at least a great deal of trouble. Now, this is where most accounts of the Overmountain men in the American Revolution end. They come in, they win this great victory at Kings Mountain, and then they go back home, they retreat across the mountains, and they go back to causing trouble with the Indians, and that's the end of the story. What I think a lot of people don't know is there is a third phase of their involvement, or lack thereof, in the Revolution, in the Southern campaigns, that lasts from late 1780 to early 1781. And it happens during the campaigns of this guy right here, Major General Nathaniel Greene. He assumes command of the Southern Army on the 14th of October, the same day that Campbell is asking these guys to stop plundering the inhabitants, the same day that they start hanging these Tories 3 at a time from tree branches. Greene comes and he assumes command of the American forces. And what a lot of people don't know is that from the time he assumes command, there's a lot of hope among Eastern authorities that the Overmountain men will continue to participate in these campaigns. November 1780, Thomas Jefferson, by this time he's the governor of Virginia. He does a lot worse job as governor of Virginia than he does writing the Declaration of Independence, but he writes to these commanders of Virginia's southwestern counties, the Overmountain counties, and he notes the peculiar aptitude of the mode of warfare to which your people are habituated, and asks them to strike a decisive blow to the southern operations of our enemies. So there's this hope that the Overmountain men are going to rally again. They're going to come back east of the mountains, and they're going to augment Greene's army and hopefully, strike a fatal blow to Cornwallis. And Cornwallis is pushing back up into North Carolina. After he's, licked his wounds from this campaign in the fall of 1780, he's going to be pushing back into North Carolina in December of 1780 and January of 1781, and Greene is going to be tasked with stopping him. Now, the problem is this same adherence to the homestead ideal, the homestead ethic that determines that the most important thing to these frontiersmen is holding and maintaining and defending a farm big enough to support a family and the security of that family. That factor played in their favor when Ferguson threatened to march west of the mountains. Now it's operating against their mobilization because the British have learned that if you want to stop the Overmountain men, the best thing to do is to use the Cherokees. So there's kind of a two-pronged strategy that Cornwallis is going to employ, which means using the main British army to confront Greene in the east, and then he's going to convince the Cherokees to attack the Overmountain men in the west. So while Cornwallis is pushing north again, the Overmountain men have their hands full with Cherokee attacks in December of 1780 that's going to force John Sevier and another militia officer from southwestern Virginia, Arthur Campbell, to launch an offensive into the Cherokee towns. And the decisive battle of this campaign is going to happen not that far from here, maybe 20, 30 miles away at a place called Boyd's Creek. It's in Sevier County, and this is the monument that stands near the site of the battle. So this homestead ethic is a double-edged sword, right? It can convince the Overmountain men to take the offensive against the British, or it can convince them to stay at home when the threat is closer to home. Now, Greene doesn't give up. Greene is still trying to get the Overmountain men to mobilize. In January of 1781, Greene writes a letter to William Campbell and Isaac Shelby, and he requests a reinforcement from, as he puts it, over the mountain for 1 month's service with the main army. He says, enable us to push the enemy in turn and add new splendor to your own glory and give the world another proof of the bravery of the mountain militia. February, Greene finally gets word that troops from Virginia and present-day Tennessee, about 2,000 men are headed to join them. So this is twice the number of men that were at Kings Mountain, right? If these men arrive, this is going to be a tremendous boost to the number of militia that Greene has. As it turns out, the Overmountain men don't arrive until next month, and then it's William Campbell from southwestern Virginia with only a few dozen riflemen. He arrives just in time to take place, to take a role at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781. If you look way down there on the edge of the American line, there's I think I've got a laser pointer here. Can we? Right down here, there's a small little contingent of riflemen from southwestern Virginia that operate on the American flank. And by the time the battle is over, Campbell and the Virginians are ready to go home. They're really mad. They think they've been mistreated. They're like Rodney Dangerfield. They think they haven't gotten enough respect. And so Campbell is going to go back across the mountains, and then he's going to die later that year, not long after being promoted to brigadier general. Now, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse is going to cost Cornwallis so many casualties that he's going to give up on the Carolinas, and he's going to go to Virginia, where it's easier for him to use the rivers to get reinforcements. And so Greene is going to concentrate on trying to conquer those outposts that the British have established throughout the Carolina backcountry. So again, Nathaniel Greene is going to ask for support from the Overmountain men. He writes to Isaac Shelby in present-day northeastern Tennessee, asking him to mobilize 1,000 men in the summer of 1781. Shelby says, well, we can't do that because we're still having trouble with the Cherokees. We don't have a formal treaty with them yet. And also the harvest is at hand. So again, it's farms and the security of their families prevent them from rallying. Despite these obstacles, Sevier and Shelby managed to round up about 700 men. And then they hear that the British are withdrawing to the low country. The officers are unwilling to march so far and be away from home from so long. And so the expedition is aborted. Greene, who again is the eternal optimist, decides that he's going to try to make another appeal in the fall of 1781, and he sends this letter to John Sevier on the 1st of September. And it's worth quoting in full because you can see how he's trying to win the Overmountain men over. He says, I feel myself happy in the prosecution of the Southern War, in the ready and effectual support which may be had under the most pressing emergencies from the mountain militia, formidable to their enemies and zealous in the service of their country. So he figures the best way to win these guys over is to butter them up and tell them, what formidable soldiers they are. Now, what about this issue of giving security to their farms and families? Greene is going to try to convince them that the best defense for their homesteads is an offense against the British. Nothing can give you security and repose upon the frontiers for any length of time but driving out the enemy from their strongholds here below, that is in the east, as they are the spring from whence all the poison floweth that produces such convulsions and cruelties among the Indians and Tories. Greene says, look, you want to defend the frontier from Indians and Tories. The best way to do that is to defeat the British in the east. To borrow a phrase from a much later American war, he says, we have to fight them over there so that you guys don't have to fight them over here, right? All the supplies and the support that the Indians and the Tories are receiving are coming from the British. So if you want to stop that from happening, let's cut the British out of the Carolinas, and then we'll cut the support out from under the Indians. October 1781, as Greene is still planning to try to pin the British in Charleston, he again writes to Sevier and Shelby saying, all the militia are coming out for this purpose, and we only wait your arrival to begin our operations. He says, assistance from frontier troops is indispensably necessary. Do the Overmountain men show up that fall? Yes, they do. They finally arrive in South Carolina in October, but it's only a few hundred men. They arrive in the camp of Francis Marion, the famous swamp fox in the Low Country, and they don't stay there for very long. Sevier hopes to enlist some of them to remain in South Carolina for a 12-month stint, and he offers to pay their bounties himself until the state can reimburse him. So Sevier is offering to pay these men out of his own pocket to try to convince them to stay. And it doesn't work. By November the 27th, they're gone. Greene, who had expected them to stay until the spring, or hopefully until he could take Charleston back from the British, complains that their departure, he says, both embarrasses and exposes us. So what we see during the duration of the Southern campaign, from the summer of 1780 until the fall of 1781, this kind of window in which the Overmountain men participate at various times, is that the tempo and the nature of their participation depends entirely on their ability of their leaders to mobilize them, or their inability to mobilize them, their conviction that they can best defend their homesteads by taking the offense or by remaining on the defense, and their need for security. Now, in saying all this, my purpose is not to diminish the Overmountain men's patriotism or their contribution to American victory. It is rather to underscore an essential fact. Mobilization in the American Revolution presents all Americans, no matter where they live, frontier, seaboard, cities, countryside, east, west, north, south, with really difficult and dangerous choices. Do I sign up to fight, or do I stay home? For the Overmountain men, those choices were a lot more stark than they were for many others, because the threat was so imminent and so close to hand. It's one thing for Washington to tell his soldiers, as he does when he's trying to get them to re-enlist after his great victory at Trenton in December of 1776, to say, your wives, your homes, your families, your property, everything is at stake. You have to turn out now to fight the British to secure this stuff. It's another thing to say that when your property and your wives and your families and your homes are under imminent threat from an enemy that will fall on those homes if you march east over the mountains to take on the British. So do the Overmountain men fight for their homesteads by taking the offensive east of the mountains, or do they do it by maintaining a defensive posture west of them? It's a much greater dilemma than most other revolutionaries are facing. The Overmountain men did not rally as often or as quickly as revolutionary authorities in the East wished, nor did they always do so in the numbers they asked for. But in the critical days of the fall of 1780, when there's no other organized American resistance in South Carolina, when there's nobody to carry the battle except for these backwoods militia, they did rally on their own initiative, on their own terms, as volunteers, and in retrospect, that was enough to make a critical difference. Thanks very much for coming, and I look forward to answering whatever questions you have.
First of all, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Lynch. This was an absolutely fascinating lecture. This was really, really wonderful. I'm sure everybody else agreed. I want to start off with just a couple questions, too, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take questions from the audience. I will, Dr. Sofer last week did this where instead of going off to the side, if I could have you come maybe down one of the aisles, I can bring the microphone over so you can ask the question and he can answer them. But let me start off. One question I have, you mentioned that one of the reasons for the British campaign in the South was that they would rally these loyalists, they would rally these Tories. It raises the question, obviously Patrick Ferguson was able to raise this loyalist force at Kings Mountain and elsewhere. Can you say anything about the social basis of loyalist support? Who were these people in general? Was there anything distinctive about those on the loyalist side of South Carolina? I know you have Scottish Highlanders in the Cape Fear. I don't know if these are among them.
Yeah.
Ferguson himself is, but I don't know if the people fighting under him are or what. Is there any sort of social, whether it's economic class, whether it's kinship or some sort of loyalty or whatever it is, that might explain why some of these men on the loyalist side were fighting with Ferguson?
First of all, let me start off with this disclaimer. I should have probably actually started at the outset with this, is that as I mentioned before, my day job is running the Lincoln Museum, and every year we send a delegation to this. They have a big ceremony on the National Mall for Lincoln's birthday that's organized by the National Park Service and an organization of descendants of Union veterans. And when I was flying back, I caught something on the plane, and so if I make a mistake, it's in answering a question or say something that's incoherent, it's because I think my body is made up of about 90% Dayquil right now. I've been taking so much. If I'm sweating profusely, it's not the lights, that's what it is. But yeah, so I think, there are some traditional interpretations that the mistake that the British make is in assuming there are more loyalists in the South than there really are. And what I think is actually the case is that the mistake that the British make isn't in so much in overestimating the amount of loyalist support. There are a lot of Tories in the South, especially in the backcountry. The mistake is in assuming that they had South Carolina secure before they really did, and therefore they sort of left the Tories too much to the mercy of a lot of these, of their neighbors who were patriots. But as far as the basis of loyalism goes, that's actually a really good question, because there's been a lot of work on the nature of Southern loyalism, and everybody wants to try to find a magic bullet, that will explain why some people became patriots and some became loyalists. Is it based on wealth? Is it based on their ethnic background? There's been one effort to explain loyalism on the frontier by arguing that the more recently settled you were on the frontier, the likelier you were to be a loyalist. There's some indication that at least in some regions it does correlate with your kind of your nationality or your ethnic background. You mentioned the Scots around the Cape Fear area. There's kind of a pocket of loyalism among them, and it's kind of crushed very, very early in the war. And then in terms of Southwest Virginia, there's a really interesting account. There's a woman who's the wife of a Tory, and she writes to this local Patriot commander, and her husband's a loyalist, and she's writing saying, I know my idiot husband has caused all these problems. Please don't take our property, and she in this letter she seems to indicate that that loyalism is partly a phenomenon of settlers of Welsh background. And we know that in a lot of other regions in America, loyalists tend to be members of a kind of a very vulnerable, visible minority, right? If you're a member of a very vulnerable, visible minority, then the crown offers you a certain amount of protection that you're not going to find elsewhere, and so there may be something to this idea that minorities on the frontier, like Welsh settlers, are kind of prone to loyalism. But there really isn't a single factor, I think, that will sort of allow you to divide, to say this person's more likely to become a Tory and this one. Now, as you know, in East Tennessee during the Civil War, there's a correlation between wealth and support for the Confederacy. And that doesn't really seem to be the case in the backcountry during the Revolution when it comes to determining allegiance. And also, there's some people that are just out of principle. There's the wealthiest settler, the wealthiest man in Western Virginia along the New River during the Revolution is a guy named William Preston. He lives at a plantation called Smithfield, and I think Smithfield. And in his papers, you'll find a lot of correspondence with Tories. Preston is trying to go easy on them. He's trying to persuade them to come around to the Patriot side and not use coercion. And and some of the Tories are just, it's ideological. They're just convinced that rebellion against your sovereign is wrong. So I don't think it can all be reduced to material or social factors.
One other question, sort of flip around to talk about the actual Overmountain men. One figure who did appear at the muster and who is sort of had a larger than life effect, but I'm curious if maybe it's what you can say about his effect, but it's Reverend Samuel Doak, Presbyterian minister. I mean, again, if we think of the sort of background of many of them were, as we talked about last week, Scots-Irish Presbyterians. Mm-hmm. And Doak was obviously very influential, and he gave this very, very famous sermon here. How influential was he? I mean, obviously the memory of him holds up, and certainly later on in East Tennessee history. But I wonder, was he, who are the people who are exhorting the crowd, exhorting people into joining? I mean, if you could say something about that kind of moral influence.
Yeah, Doak is a frontier Presbyterian who gives the sermon at the muster at Sycamore Shoals. They muster on September the 25th of 1780, and then they march off. They cross the river on September the 26th, and Doak gives this sermon. His text is the story of Gideon from the book of Judges. And the traditional account of the muster is that he ends he gives the cheer, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, and all the Overmountain men repeat it, and then they go marching off. But I don't really think that I don't think that Doak himself was really that instrumental in terms of the organization of the muster itself, because these sort of muster day sermons and military sermons by chaplains during the Revolution are really common among both continental units and among militia units. I think the most instrumental figure is in the Kings Mountain expedition is really Isaac Shelby himself. But there's a big caveat to that, because most of what we know about the organization of that campaign comes from Isaac Shelby's own post-war writings. And Isaac Shelby was a guy who had a lot of chips on his shoulder. And as a matter of fact, one of his big motives for writing was the fact that a lot of William Campbell's descendants were arguing that since Campbell was sort of the, nominal head of the expedition, that Shelby didn't really do anything. And Shelby writes these letters to Sevier in the 18 teens after they're both old, and they both become governors. Shelby becomes the first governor of Kentucky, and Sevier becomes the first governor of Tennessee, and they're both really concerned with their revolutionary laurels and their reputations. And Shelby writes these series of letters to Sevier saying, Campbell really didn't do anything. It was mostly us, and and Campbell was just kind of there, and I nominated Campbell to command, and I only did it because the other guy, Charles McDowell, was so old, and I was afraid somebody would nominate him. And the problem is, after John Sevier dies, Sevier's son finds these letters, and he says, well, this is really interesting. This is our history. People need to know this. And he publishes all those letters in the newspaper. And so all of Campbell's descendants read this, and Isaac Shelby was less than thrilled, But the interesting thing is he doesn't back down. His honor is dependent on sticking to these accounts that he's written. And so there's this really ugly pamphlet war between Shelby and Campbell's descendants about who really deserves the credit for the battle. But by all indication, and again, all the indication comes from Shelby himself, is that Shelby was really the prime mover behind getting things rolling. Yeah.
Why don't I open it up to if anybody in the audience has a question? You can either come down that side or this side. Does anybody have a particular question, or I don't know if I can? You want to?
Thank you, and thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Is it
It's the second time I've dropped my phone. I'm just going to leave it there.
in your account? One point that you make is that Major Ferguson makes a serious diplomatic error. Had he not made that error, or would things have turned out differently? Is there any imaginable scenario or plausible scenario whereby the British do hold the Carolinas for some length of time?
Yeah, that's a really good question, counterfactual. So before the Overmountain men returned to South Carolina to take on Ferguson, and again, a lot of this is coming from Shelby's post-war accounts, there had been discussions about further cooperation between the Overmountain men and the backcountry men east of the mountains in the Carolinas. And so I think it's likely that there would have been some involvement by members of the mountain militia in present-day East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia in some capacity, even without the threat. But I think the threat makes it more immediate, and it makes their it draws them out in much greater numbers. Now, as far as the British continuing to hold South Carolina, that's another really good question. I think it's possible to envision a scenario in which the British maybe could have secured a more permanent foothold in western North Carolina had the Kings Mountain expedition not happened. And if that had happened, then the scenario that we're looking at in early 1781, where Greene really wears down and defeats a significant portion of Cornwallis's army, not Greene personally, but one of his subordinates at the Battle of Cowpens, where that doesn't happen. And if Cornwallis doesn't get really, really frustrated with his inability to hold the Carolinas, then it's questionable that he would have gone to Virginia at all. And if he doesn't go to Virginia, then there's no Yorktown. I think the real question with the way the Southern campaign turned out is how much territory the British could have held on to in the subsequent treaty negotiations. If they had maintained a greater foothold in the Carolinas at the time of the surrender, then it's possible that the 13 colonies could have been dismembered, and that the British could have continued to hold, to maintain provinces in Georgia and parts of the Carolinas, which is really where a lot of the wealth in the colonies came from. You know, those cash crop exports from South Carolina and the Indian trade that those interior posts facilitated, I think would have been something worth holding on to. So, you know, that's one of the big questions about the Southern campaign is that I think a lot of historians has raised is if you know, if the British had played their cards in the South more effectively, then the Union as it emerged, if it wouldn't have prevented independence, it at least could have restricted the independent U.S. to sort of from Virginia to the north. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, this is kind of a follow-up to Dr. Astor's question about the motivation of those who served, whether with the Tories or the Patriots. And I've been doing a little bit of research and have encountered an individual who was with Rutherford in the Cherokee Indian Wars in '76 and did a little bit more. And then in 1780 was with the Tories at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And then in '81 was back with the Patriots. And so I'm curious, how common was that, you know, in terms of their, you know, motivations and why they would have been switching sides back and forth?
Yeah, that's a good question. People who change sides. In the case of somebody who marches with Rutherford in 1776 and then joins the Tories in 1780, that's not at all that unusual. And what we're referring to here is in the summer of 1776, there's this huge Cherokee onslaught against settlements in present-day East Tennessee, southwestern Virginia, and the western Carolinas. And then there's sort of a retaliatory expedition that's launched from Virginia and the Carolinas into the Cherokee towns to punish the Cherokees for this campaign that they wage in the late summer of 1776, and Rutherford is the North Carolina officer who leads the North Carolina contingent into the Cherokee towns. And it's not unusual to see men who are involved in the Cherokee campaign in 1776 who then support the British in 1780, because the Cherokee uprising in 1776 affects everybody along the frontier. There's one historian who wrote a book about the South Carolina upcountry, and she says the Cherokees did a lot more for the Americans as enemies than they could have done as allies, because once the Cherokees go to war, and when the British are wrongly blamed for instigating that uprising in 1776, it convinces a lot of settlers in the backcountry to pitch in on the side of the Patriot armies that are putting down this Cherokee invasion, or I should say counter invasion, because it was the Cherokees' land before it was the settlers' land. But 1780, it's really kind of a rational choice to support the British if you're in the Carolinas from the middle of 1780 at least through the fall, because the British are on the ascendancy. Two different American armies have been completely wiped out. One at Charleston, again, it's the worst American defeat of the entire war. And then there's a humiliating battlefield defeat of the Americans at Camden. It looks like South Carolina is totally in American hands. There's one British commander who says of South Carolina, he says, pretty much everybody in this entire province is either in arms with us or they're our prisoners. Cornwallis is pushing into North Carolina. There's no indication that anybody is really coming to stop him. And a lot of figures who would later become prominent in the Patriot movement, when Charleston falls, they take British protection. They're willing to set out the war if the British will leave them alone. A lot of men who will be prominent commanders in the militia When Charleston falls, they say, okay, that's it, I'm sitting the rest of this out. We put up a pretty decent fight. And then they're drawn back into the battle because when the British push into the backcountry and they start burning houses and things of that sort. But there's a lot of movement of men back and forth. A lot of the prisoners from Kings Mountain will switch sides. There's actually one guy at Kings Mountain who he joins Ferguson's force the day before the Battle of Kings Mountain. I mean, you want to talk about horrible luck, right, in the American Revolution. He joins Ferguson's force the day before the Battle of Kings Mountain, and then he applies for a pension. This is the funny part. He applies for a pension to get as a Revolutionary War soldier. And he says in his pension, before the battle was over, I saw the error of my ways. He sees all of his buddies getting killed around him, and so he signs on to fight with the Americans. And and he serves with the Americans for the rest of the war. But Nathaniel Greene, at one point, he said by the end of the Southern campaign, we were fighting the British with their former soldiers, and they were fighting us with our former soldiers. There are former soldiers from the Maryland line. I mean, these are the best Continentals in the entire regular American Army. Crack soldiers, best regiments in the entire regular Continental Army. And some of these guys, when they're captured, they sign up for the British Legion, which is like the most detested of all the units in the British Army. So yeah, there are a lot of turncoats.
Let me warn you, I am a mountain man.
Well, good.
That I had 6 or 7 grandfathers at Kings Mountain and have read everything I can find about it. And I'm a descendant of Samuel Doak.
Oh, good. Cool.
Who wanted to go, after preaching a sermon, wanted to go to Kings Mountain with the troops, but they wouldn't allow him because he didn't have a good enough horse, and they left him as in charge of the militia.
Yeah.
And he was a character, but that's not what we're here about tonight. Couple of things that are background. The ones of us who settled this side of the mountain were primarily Scot-Irish. In the 1790s, we were about 90% Presbyterian. By the 1800s, the Baptists had moved in and picked up the country churches. And I mention that for a reason. The lowland Carolinians, South Carolina and North Carolinians, were English. That's where the Episcopal Church was strong.
Right, yeah.
And there are lots of good stories about the conflicts, but they were strong, and we've been fighting the English since 1066. We were in between them.
That is deep background, right?
So it's a little hard to get along with the English. I really think that we're descendants of the Picts, who were the only people that the Romans never whipped. But you had, on this side of the mountain, probably the best fighters in the world. When William Penn was having trouble with the frontier, he asked where could he get some settlers, and he was told, hunt the Scot-Irish Presbyterians because they're the meanest, most orderly group anywhere. They'll solve your problem.
Right, yeah.
And we did. The Indians all disappeared. Now, where they went, that's for you to...
Yeah, there were a lot of Scots-Irish settlers from Pennsylvania to the south were actually... Yeah, they were solicited to come and act as a buffer against the Indians. Yeah.
What?
Were you here last week? You missed it. I got to know all this last week. You missed it. Man,
Well, I've tried to educate him on some, but sometimes I fail.
It came through. But I can attest it. I mean, we talked about the frontier in Pennsylvania. The Scots-Irish were often caught in between.
Yeah.
They were on the frontier, and so they were almost used as a buffer in many ways.
Yeah, there were a lot of and especially in Pennsylvania, but also in Virginia and in the Carolinas. There were recruiting agents. They would recruit, and you're right. In the backcountry, there was there's heavy Scotch-Irish settlement. They were recruited to come in and settle as a kind of to form a kind of defensive barrier between the lowland colonists and the Indians. And the idea at the time was that because a lot of these people came from these border areas of England where they were used to fighting and border reaving and things like that, that they would sort of keep that they were suited to settling in frontier conditions. And so there is, there's kind of a heavy Scotch-Irish contingent at Kings Mountain, but also, Isaac Shelby is a Welshman. I think his father was actually a Welsh immigrant. John Sevier is French Huguenot. There's a first-generation German immigrant is among the colonels. Frederick Hambright, was born in Germany, yeah, more Scots-Irish in the backcountry than you were likely to find in other parts of the colonies.
Well,
yeah.
They were experienced fighters.
Yes.
And they had taken the land, and they didn't want them to come in. And I think that there was bad feelings between the Carolina countrymen, and that Blunt and a lot of those folks were Carolina landowners, gentry, that came over that were put in charge of us. Sevier was not particularly that, but when you look at the makeup of our leaders, it didn't come out of the Carolina. That Campbell was a great leader. Greene did very well. He got a 15,000 acre land grant just out of Columbia, Tennessee for his service. Mm-hmm. Beautiful country. So I think we have to look some at who we were before the Revolutionary War.
Oh, yeah. There's a really, and I'd recommend a book that came out, I think, just last year by Colin Calloway called Hard Neighbors. If you're interested in the early settlements of Scotch-Irish in America and the role that they played in early Indian conflicts and the Revolution, it's one of the best books on that topic that I've read. Colin Calloway, he mostly writes Native American history, but this is kind of his most recent book, and it focuses on the relationship between these Scots-Irish settlers and their recruitment to settle on the frontier and their dealings with the Indians. Yeah.
George Lane here was reminding me of there 200 or 250, did you say? 200 Revolutionary War soldiers buried in Blount County. Many of them, I know there's a memorial at Eusebia Presbyterian Church in Blount County, which is obviously there's a lot of descendants of the war who have settled here. I think another book that's actually it's an earlier phase is Kevin Kenny's book about the Paxton Boys.
Oh yeah,
and that's another great book. It really gets into the details of how William Penn's sort of Pennsylvania experiment sort of breaks down. And then again, it's the Scots-Irish, but they're not alone. You have a lot of Germans who are also Palatine Germans.
Right, yeah.
It's, the ethnic component can be overstated and understated in time. We have time for one more question, if anybody has one more question. All right, Cypress, we'll get the last word in here.
So from last time, Dr. Astor here talked about the Cherokee and the Native Americans, and from here we've talked about the American Revolution, both perspectives. My main question is, why did they not work better with each other? It felt like the entire issue with the Mountain Men could have been solved easier if they had squeezed them together, the Cherokee and the British at the same time, rather than going back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So why do the British in the east and the Cherokees in the west, why don't they coordinate more carefully to try to push the settlers from two different directions? I think one of the answers to that question is because early in the war, the men who are responsible for formulating Native American policy, the British Indian superintendents, and this would be John Stewart, Henry Stewart, and then Alexander Cameron, who's the British agent for the Cherokees. Their priority was not in using the Cherokees for military purposes, it was more just keeping the Cherokees in the British orbit. When the Cherokees are on the verge of launching this attack in the summer of 1776, the British agents are actually trying to restrain them. If you read a lot of early books on Tennessee history, they blame the British for instigating this attack, and it's actually the other way around. It's when these young Cherokee warriors are contemplating, these attacks on the settlements. Henry Stewart and Alexander Cameron, the British Indian, basically sort of like ambassadors to the Cherokees on the part of the British. They're saying, oh my God, please guys, don't do this now. The last thing we want is a whole-scale attack on the frontiers, and partly it's because at that point the British weren't really in a position to move in the east. Now there are early British attempts to use conventional British forces on the coast. In 1776, there's a British attempt on Sullivan's Island in Charleston Harbor, which fails, and then there's the uprising of the Scottish loyalists in North Carolina, and they're defeated, and so the British weren't really in a position, I think, to take advantage of those attacks, and it wasn't really the priority of the Indian agents to use them in a military capacity at that time. Now, in 1780. This is something that I think is interesting because people always focus on the failures of British policy in the South, but I mean there's a sense in which after Kings Mountain that strategy it almost kind of works, right? You got to remember that the Cornwallis and the British commanders in the South, they don't really know that the Overmountain men are coming in the fall of 1780. They don't really even know they're there. If you look at memoirs of the war written by British officers who participated in the Southern campaign, you can tell when they're referring to the Overmountain men, they don't really know who these guys are or where they are. There's one of them who claims that Daniel Boone was at the Battle of Kings Mountain, just because they're thinking frontier, Daniel Boone. There's another British officer who says these guys came from settlements we had never even heard of before, Watauga, Nolichucky. Who's heard of the Nolichucky River, if you're in Britain. And by the time by the aftermath of Kings Mountain, if you look at in the winter of 1780 and 1781, Cornwallis he's actively telling Thomas Brown, who's the new sort of British, he's the new British agent to the Indians, British Southern superintendent, telling them to fall on the western settlements. And that policy kind of works because, again, when Greene is trying to get these guys to return and reinforce his army, Shelby and Sevier are saying, hey, we got our hands full with the Indians. We've got to get a treaty with the Indians done, and then we'll talk about coming east to fight. And so in that sense, the British Southern strategy, that two-sided strategy you're talking about, it kind of works. I mean, it doesn't work well enough to stop Greene from inflicting these terrible losses on Cornwallis. Cornwallis isn't able to maintain his grip on the Carolinas, but it does keep the Overmountain men tied down to a point where, where Greene's militia numbers are never as high as he hoped they would be. So I mean, people like to trash the British strategists, and it came too little and too late. But eventually, I mean, they did manage to use the Southern Indians pretty effectively. But early in the war, their priority wasn't unleashing the Cherokees against the Westerners. It was actually trying to prevent them from doing so. They said, let's slow down. Let's attack once we have sufficient British numbers in the South to take advantage of it, and then let's make sure that we discriminate and don't attack people who are our buddies. But but that's a good question.
All right, well, I think that brings us to a conclusion, and I think I would like to give another round of applause to Dr. Michael Lynch.
Thank you, thanks.
Wonderful presentation. And I'd like, once again, invite everybody to come out to the lobby. There's refreshments out in the lobby, I believe. Is that right? And also, but also very importantly, to come back on March the 23rd for Dr. Chris Magra, who was his advisor, dissertation advisor from the University of Tennessee, who will come and talk about the Watauga Association, its influence on Declaration of Independence, and on the future United States and the state of Tennessee. Thank you very much again, and enjoyed having you, and have a good night.